This is Interpreting Wine host and founder Lawrence Francis welcoming you back to the Market Pulse UK Series 2026. Today's conversation features Ben Easey of Parade Wines in Suffolk. We first hear Ben's origin story and get an insight into his day-to-day role, working as he is to establish a broader wine culture in the region, using his experience picked up working in hospitality in London. We discuss Ben's customers at Parade Wines and specifically what influences their buying decisions. We discuss the broader trends that Ben is paying attention to, not only in his local Suffolk market, but also out there in the French wine growing regions where he sources much of his wine. Before closing on his green and red flags when buying wines, and looking ahead to some exciting events Ben's got planned for the rest of 2026. Enjoy. So, Ben, welcome. It's great to have you on as part of the series. And just as a starter for 10, really, let's get into just introducing you. So in the pre-podcast questionnaire, you gave me your origin story. And this, as I can tell, seems to have three main stages. There's the university phase where you discovered wine and fell in love with wine. There's the, I guess, learning and doing, kind of majestic, working in hospitality. And then there's what I would call going in alone and kind of starting your own business. And I wonder if you would give me and give us that 2-minute, 3-minute version of that story, of course, in your own words.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me on, Lawrence. Quite excited to be here. Yeah, I wish it kind of broke down into 3 succinct parts like you explain it. It felt like quite a long journey. I sort of hopped in and out of wine. You know, I speak to a lot of people who kind of say they couldn't be doing anything else, or like wine chose them and kind of was like obvious, and they wouldn't ever be entertaining the idea of doing something else. For me, it was kind of like I always was like trying to do something else, and the one thing I kept falling back into was wine. So yeah, at university I studied music. I mean, I guess like I think all the time I wish I'd gone and studied enology or viticulture or something, but you know, I suppose the nature of alcohol means that when you're 16, that doesn't really seem like a viable option. Unless you've got family background in it, I suppose. So I was mad keen into music. I loved like researching bands. I loved learning about how one drummer would be playing in a bunch of different bands, or this singer had appeared on a different album, and doing all this crazy research. I used to spend hours and hours pouring through band biographies and Wikipedia histories. And when I sort of stumbled into learning about wine, that research element really resonated with me. Like all these endless books and maps and reading about places and people and finding out how a producer had worked here and then worked there and where they're working now and all that kind of thing. And I think that almost more than the product initially was what I fell in love with. And so I kind of went to Majestic because they put me through the WSET, and it felt like a good way to learn about wine. They had this huge product range. They had their got a tasting counter with wines open all the time. So we were constantly trying products from all over the world. And I was just learning as I went along, and I loved it. But after a while, that question of like, is this what I want to do for the rest of my life, started like popping back into my head. So I worked at a university for a bit and just kind of immediately realised I'd made a bad decision. First day walking into a proper office job was just like, this is not for me. I was there for like 6 months. And, you know, I was thinking about this morning. Like, it was like your podcast I was listening to a lot while sat at that desk interpreting wine early days. And there was a particular interview I remember with Margot Aubrey from Naughty Piglets that just fascinated me. I didn't know much about natural wine, and my background up until that point had been super conventional wines with Majestic and like WSET, like learning, you know, wines by the book kind of thing. And there was this whole world of wine that didn't fit into any appellation law half the time, but also certainly didn't fit into any like given textbook page that I'd been reading and stuff. And so I applied for a few jobs, but one of them was at Naughty Piglets, and I went and met Margot. I'm pretty sure I mentioned that I'd listened to the interview in that interview with Margot. And for some reason she gave me a job because I had literally no experience of natural wine or in a restaurant, but it worked out. Unfortunately, I wasn't there for as long as I really wanted to be. To be honest, I really loved it there. But then, like family opportunity to move back home, where I live now, which is in Suffolk, because my wife got a job around here, and I kind of knew long term I wanted to be in this part of the world. So it kind of fast tracked me leaving there. I came back. I wanted to set up a catering company, which I did for a little while. got experience cooking in a few local restaurants, and then COVID happened, which for the sort of private chef doing wine tastings, cooking at weddings and stuff like that kind of killed that business fairly sharpish, sadly. So then I had kind of COVID of my family backgrounds in farming. I worked on the farm for those years because it was the only thing I could do, really. And then as we came out of COVID, I started trying to push going back into like catering, but more wine focused. So I was doing wine for weddings, that kind of thing. And then that brought me to kind of where I am now, which is setting up a website and making the big leap of importing wines direct to myself. Which was, that's always for me, like narrowing the gap between a producer and the customer is like the most important thing to me. Like if I could be on the road in France or in wine regions every day of the year, I would be happily. And being able to share those stories I get from the road with people is kind of what makes me tick now. Yeah, that's what I spend my 9 to 5 doing these days.
I absolutely love it, and we'll get a little bit more into the day to day, let's say, and we'll definitely talk about that as we move through. But I think that really stood out for me actually, Ben, in your answers there, because I asked you what do you want to be known for in the local wine scene, and it was interesting that you immediately then started talking about the importance of the winemaker's stories, but then I guess also you being kind of the not exactly the representative, or maybe it is the representative, but you being obviously the person at the head of the room or at the end of the phone, and almost being the link between the vineyards and the consumer. Have I kind of got that about right? Does that feel close to
yeah, I think you're right.
I guess your motivation.
I guess like initially my like sort of tagline would be like trying to remove the middleman, but then inevitably I am the middleman between producer and customer. And unfortunately, I think it would be great if there was a route to market for producers to just be able to sell direct to customer in different countries and be over here all the time talking about their wines and stuff. But in reality, I think a big thing for me is realizing that a winemaker or a grape grower is a farmer at the end of the day, and spending their life in the vines or in the winery, and both is their expertise. That's their speciality, and actually having somebody that can go and understand that story and then take that to the customers. The middleman's kind of quite important in that sense, I think. But yeah, it's kind of a hard one because I don't really like seeing myself that way. But fundamentally, yeah, that's kind of the job.
Yeah.
But it's something I'm really passionate about. I sort of grew up in the backseat of the family car, looking at mum and dad in wineries, tasting wine, and me and my brothers sort of bored out of our minds, thinking this is literally the worst way to spend a family holiday. Can we go? And inevitably, that's exactly what my son does now. Sits in the car while I'm tasting wines, and long may the cycle continue, because once you're old enough and realize how amazing it is meeting producers, it's worth the childhood of boredom. But I think that I had this naive belief that every winery was like, little vigneron in a cave working away, selling their wares. And then as I got older and peeled back the layers of the wine trade, I realized that there are monolithic kind of companies that resemble much more, a factory than they do a winemaker crafting, a farmed product into a consumable product. And the only way I realized that was like being out on the road by myself. There are loads of people who are really interested in wine that don't do it for a living and don't get that, on the boots on the ground experience. Sharing what the difference is between, a real grower made wine and something that is commercially designed to fit a category. Not that I necessarily have anything against those. It's just not what I get excited about, and I like talking about the stuff I am excited about.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. Yeah, in some ways it's it's inefficient, but in other ways I think long may it continue, because I think there's always opportunities for people like yourself, and I think also, people like myself as well, to kind of help to, the word I like to use is bridge rather than middleman. Kind of bridge that. There is a divide. There's a gap, and of course there is, because making wine and doing things right, if you are at that smaller scale, it's more than a full-time job, isn't it? So I think it's also a sense of people who are doing the real work, accepting help, and realizing that they can't do everything themselves, which again I think creates opportunity. I think it creates connection, and I think it creates friendships as well. Again, it's kind of there's there are kind of two sides to the coin, really. But to kind of really nail this, then, Ben, in terms of your take us into your day to day. I mean, you've on the questionnaire, you chose out of the options you were given. You said, okay, I'm an importer. But I feel like that hides a lot of information about what you actually do on a day-to-day basis, which you've already started hinting at there. So give us a February 2026 snapshot of what Parade Wines is from your perspective.
Okay, I mean, 90% of my day is unfortunately boring stuff like looking at spreadsheets and working out how I can get good wine to people at the right price, etc., etc. But the kind of romantic side and the most important side as well is me out talking to kind of whoever will give me an audience about these producers. I do retail online, so I work with other importers for the bulk of my range, and then a small part of it is what I've imported myself.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've brought direct from a grower. I'm excited about both elements of it. The importer, that's ultimately where I want to be 100% imported. My sort of like big influences are people like Kermit Lynch or Keeling, like somebody like Dan Keeling Andrew, who really, they are selling wine, to put a fine point on it, but they're selling it through the story. Kermit Lynch wrote some amazing books, and he worked with some amazing restaurants, and that's how he got, grower-led wines out to people. Keeling Andrew, obviously, Noble Rot and all of that side of things has like completely changed, like added a voice to wine that kind of wasn't there in the first place. So my day-to-day is trying to do a similar thing, but in sunny Suffolk, though it's not very sunny at the moment. It's dreary, miserable Suffolk in February. But so like yesterday, I was out meeting clients. I went to a bottle shop. I went to a butcher and to a newly opened wine bar, just pouring wines for them, talking about the product, getting them excited. But kind of more importantly, talking about how we get these kind of wines moving.
Mm-hmm.
In all three of these places, these wines are going to end up being, way above what the average spend is for a bottle of wine in the UK. And so it's translating to people why that's important. And so we're always talking about, I say marketing, but marketing in the form of what tastings can we hold? How can we get people trying this wine? How can we get people excited about this wine? And, understanding that big difference between a supermarket bottle and a bottle that's made on a small scale by an artisan. And that in Suffolk is like a completely different job to what it was when I was working in London. Like we had people coming through the door all the time, interested in new stuff and trying something different, and it like completely overestimated I took for granted working in places like Naughty Piglets, because the customers in there were just, that's all they wanted, was a new experience, to try something new. Whereas now it's very much like adding one bottle of something interesting into somebody's shopping bag, which is why like working with the butcher works quite well. It kind of sounds like a bit of a bit of an odd place to try and start selling wine, but actually people are in there talking about good produce. They're asking where their meat's coming from. They're asking, who farmed it. And wine has that story too. And so if we can get somebody who is clearly interested in their produce and clearly interested in the story behind the product they're buying, if we're speaking to people like that already, then speaking to them about a bottle of wine to add on to the shop to go with their Sunday roast meat or whatever, it works quite well.
Yeah, and again, as I suspected, you put importer, but you're also. It sounds like an interesting approach to distribution, where you're actually, from what I can hear, you're building a network, and you're kind of you're being quite strategic about where you're going to fish, right? It's like, okay, I need to to mix metaphors, you're going fishing.
Yeah.
Going fishing at the butchers because you can see, and I absolutely agree with, it's like 90% of that conversation is already happening. And then it's a question of, and even more than 90%, because it's like, okay, at the sort of most food level, it's like, okay, what are you going to be drinking with your, with your Cote de Boeuf? It's like there is a window there, cross sale, there is an opportunity there. But it's interesting that because of your location, not being in London with these opportunities, I guess, a little bit more disparate, a little bit more spread out, you're needing to make those relationships think a bit longer term. But ultimately, in order to get to the customer who was jumping into your net at the Naughty Piglets, but now you're going out fishing for them.
Absolutely. I've always had this hard time. You know, a restaurant in Suffolk is less common than a pub. You know, 90% of I could walk from my house. It'd probably take half an hour, but I could walk to 2 or 3 pubs to get to an actual restaurant, like a bona fide restaurant, is a 20-minute drive. And there's not that many of them. And that's kind of just the nature of the beast with where we are, countryside living. And that's fantastic in so many ways. But from a wine drinker's perspective, the pub is not always the best place to get a bottle of wine.
Yeah.
But so for me, that's like a really point of passion is trying to get wine into pubs, better wine into pubs, because you walk into a pub, the first thing you see is 10 to 15 taps of real ales and craft beers, right? People are trying new things and drinking stuff. I mean, we have so many great real ales and craft breweries in the area, and the pubs are changing them all the time. You know, walk in and you're excited to see what they're pouring this week in that sense. And then you look at their menu or the chalkboard and it's local produce. They're talking about, you know, where their fish came from. We're on a heritage coastline with amazing fish and amazing fishmongers and fish boats coming in, day boats coming in with great fish on it. And restaurants are so good at shouting about that. They're talking more and more about who the farmer is that, you know, put the meat on the table. And then you look at the wine list and it's like a polar opposite. It's like yin and yang. Like it's like hugely mass produced wines that are literally on there because they're priced right for GP, and that's it. And you know, it's like, who am I to go into a restaurant or a pub and tell them how to run a wine menu, right? They're the ones that are selling the wine at the end of the day. They're the ones that meet the customers every day, and they know their customer base so much better than me. And so my goal has never been to walk in there and be like, let's change your wine list. Like, I'll put on a load of low intervention, organic, natural wines or whatever, or grower made wines or different wines for them. But I just really want to work with them to be like, can we just have like a specials menu for your wines, basically? Let's have a couple of wines on there that are a bit interesting. You can take them in low quantities and let's try and get something interesting moving through the pub before the drinker that comes in and wants something, you know, something that fits in with everything else that they're doing in a great way in terms of championing local produce and well-made produce. You know, at the end of the day, there's just like all the pubs still have huge breweries on there. Like, you can still, in any pub in Suffolk, you can get something from Burnt Mill, one of our amazing craft beers, that's made locally in small, on a fairly small scale, or Ampersand or somebody like that. But you can also get Carling and Carlsberg and Stella, right? Like, they work well in tandem. There are people who want a pint of Stella. And there are people who want something really crafty. And I think that's the same for a wine drinker. And because I'm small, you know, it's just me, I'm happy to go and drop off a case of wine when I'm passing, just so they can try out something new and have it on the menu. If they want something different the next week, like, let's do that. I'm really excited to work with people, you like, get the wines moving, get people excited about it, and then drive events in that way too. Like, I think that really helps on top of, you can't just put a wine on a list and expect it to start moving, because people don't get that dialogue by reading a piece of paper. And so, like, the tastings are really important. Going and talking to customers and doing those in a way that works for the restaurants is really important. Doing them on days where they wouldn't, you know, otherwise be fully booked, so they've got, you know, extra customers in doing something different.
And again, I feel the mission, I feel the long-term vision, which again I think is for me, I think it follows again from your experience at, you know, somewhere like Norley Piglets, somebody like, you know, Margot, with that enthusiasm and really a community around wine and around the restaurant. But what I'd really like us to then focus in on, because all of this I think is naturally leading kind of step by step here, is actually to talk about your current customer. Because in the questionnaire, I asked you to set a price range within which most of your sales fall, and you chose the £20 to £40 range, which is, I think, you know, there'll probably be people in the industry that kind of nod along like, yeah, that's a great sweet spot. But, you know, kind of, you know, the punters out there, you know, to be falling into that price range, I think, you know, thumbs up, something's going right. So what do you think you're doing right, or what do you think they're doing right to feel good and keep coming back at or around that price point?
I think that is less about what I'm doing and more of a market shift anyway. I mean, I certainly sell the least quantity of wine I've ever sold, but the average price has crept up in the sense that I think people are drinking less. And when they do drink, they want to they want to, not necessarily they want to spend more, but they're kind of happy to, because take me as an example, less so one of my customers. I used to drink a bottle a day probably, or I certainly would open a bottle a day, and I don't do that anymore. And so when I do on a weekend, I don't really worry so much about the cost of the bottle. I kind of go into a shop. When I'm a customer, I go into a shop and I'm looking for something unique and something interesting that I want to try. And because I've kind of been, without attempting to, but saving my drinking money all week, I have a little bit more in my wallet to go and spend on something.
And it might be a bit more of a stretch, but I'd love, if possible, do you have any of that sort of info about your customers? Because I think it's interesting that you're obviously, you're in the spreadsheet, you're seeing the volumes, you're seeing the average prices. Do you know why? Are people telling you why?
I think my average bottle spend is actually £17 for a customer. That's what their average spending on a bottle. But most of the wines I sell, I'm kind of more top heavy because because I work with such small scale, like they are naturally more boutique wines and they kind of fall probably more into the 20 to £30 bracket than 20 to 40. So many of my customers actually are asking me how much should I spend on a bottle of wine to get a decent bottle of wine. And every time I do a tasting, that is by far and away, like the most common question I get asked. How much should I spend on a bottle of wine to get quality? I always say 25 quid. I mean, the first time somebody asks, the best thing is to always show them that classic diagram that you always get taught about early in your wine career of how much of your money actually goes on the wine in the bottle. I think it's really hard working in the trade. I first saw that within the first week of working for Majestic, because we got taught that's how you sell a bottle of wine, to talk about things like that. When you're in the trade, talking to people in the trade all the time, you sort of forget those things that we take for granted, having learned them ages ago. People still don't realize, having to put prices up because duty's gone up like 3 times in the past year and a half or whatever. Like explaining that to a customer, and a £10 bottle of wine is now, the wine's worth even less than it was 18 months ago.
Yeah.
And so, like, when you really boil it down, like sitting in a pub and just talking to somebody about that element of a pub wine at 25 quid, like realistically, how much the wine in that bottle actually costs for you to then end up spending £25 on it in a pub is ludicrous. And sometimes I feel like somebody should write a sort of Kitchen Confidential-esque, like, big reveal of how expensive wine gets when you're in a restaurant or a pub, for what it actually costs them and then what it's actually cost to make. But then other times I think, why would anybody write that? Because then they'll never ever sell a bottle of wine in a pub. But there's some great people who are being more transparent about it. I mean, Fallow, the restaurant, are very transparent on Instagram about it. And actually, when you read the comments, people are quite open to understanding why a restaurant charges that much and understanding why it's needed. And so when you start explaining to people that element of it, and what you actually get for 25 quid in terms of wine in a bottle, and the kind of farmer you're then supporting when you're spending that much, makes the sale easier. Though I would say that a lot of people will massively increase their average spend by buying like 6 bottles of quite reasonable wine, like something like Chin Chin will fly out, like, because it's really, really well priced. And then because they've, in theory, like saved money by buying a really good wine at a good price, they'll then whack in like a £40 bottle, which brings their average spend up massively. And I think that's also not a bad way to drink, to be honest, as a consumer. Like, if you've got a dinner party, after the first bottle, realistically, how much are people thinking about the wine they're drinking? So it's great to be able to get some reasonably priced wines that are still pretty good. Chin Chin's a really good example of that. And so is a lot of like regional French wine, particularly ones that are made in places like Carcassonne. And if they're from a like less common grape, you can so often get brilliant value out of it. And then this is the way I drink often, and I talk to customers who do the same thing. Like on Saturday night, you don't drink amazing wine because you're drinking quite a lot of it, but then you're saving like a great bottle for your Sunday roast.
Yeah, it's so interesting because what I've written down here is left brain, right brain. What you're kind of describing there is kind of it's like accounting, isn't it? It's like, okay, if I've saved that there, if I've shaved that price there, but in a way, people have got they've got that budget, because none of that works unless people are, for whatever reason, and maybe you can give some insight there. So I think it's interesting. People have said, I'm going to spend, they want to get to that price. They're asking you, what is that price? And it feels like the way they're using that information is like, okay, if it's 25 quid, if I spend 20 quid on this bottle or 15 quid on this bottle, that gives me 5 or 10 more to spend on the Sunday roast bottle. Yeah, that certainly happens. And some of my
sort of more consistent retail customers who buy regularly off me, like their vast majority of what they're buying is sort of everyday wine. Like they might do an order. I'm quite unique in a way. I have a few customers that will do big orders less regularly, and those big orders are formed of like what they will call, or what I would call. That's just what they'll say. Look, I want 12 everyday whites, which is something like a Macon, or that's like 10, 12 pounds, something like that. And then they've got 12 for special occasions, basically. And it brings their whole average bottle up to sort of £17 when they're doing that. But I am an independent wine merchant. My customers are looking for a bottle. Nobody's like, I don't have bricks and mortar shop. Nobody's stumbled in off the street. Like, can I grab a quick bottle before I'm going to this party with somebody I don't know very well? Like, everybody who has found me has actually been looking more often than not for a specific bottle. I then have it, and then they're buying a case. Probably because I'm small, my delivery costs are quite expensive. So if you buy more, you don't have to pay delivery, and they'd rather spend it on wine than a courier, which makes sense. And so I think my customers probably are quite unique, and a lot of them are engaged. They're interested in learning more about the story, and suggesting that £25 is where you really drive value in wine for them is something that they're really interested in, and are happy to do that. It would be a different ballgame if I had bricks and mortar and I was trying to meet a much wider caption. And then the restaurants I work with, when I'm talking to a pub and trying to get nice wines on their restaurant, that is still really, really price conscious. But that's inevitably because there's another margin going on there after mine. Fundamentally, like, money's tight. And if you're going out to a restaurant, spending quite a lot of money on the food to then whack another load of money on from a bottle of wine, you can almost double your restaurant bill by going mid-range on a wine list now. It does make it really hard. But I think the people who are, out there looking for something interesting, I have quite a few niche wines that I just buy in really small quantities. And like that kind of works well for me because somebody is specifically looking for that wine, finds it on my website, and then shops the rest of the range.
Yeah, this is exactly where my mind was going, actually, Ben, because there's a few things. So it's like, we were always talking about occasion and experience. I think these are two huge buzzwords and huge concepts in wine. And again, I know we're talking in generalities here, but you've spoken about everyday and special occasion, and right there you brought in that kind of where does the esoteric 30, 35 quid wine that's not from a known appellation, that's not from a known producer, but is banging, and is like really over delivering. I'm guessing this is where we would sort of transition in the conversation as to kind of understanding that customer and what would make them want to take a chance on that wine. And of course, a lot of that is their trust in you, and again, you kind of leading them. Bring in a bit more about experiences. Are you able to give people opportunities, by the sounds of things, to taste these wines, to talk to you face to face, or is all of this happening online, remote, on a screen?
But only because I am like booking and tastings with restaurants, working with local restaurants, a lot of the time effectively asking them for favours to indulge me and let me kind of take over a section of the restaurant so I can run an event, to share the wines. Like I'd really try to help my event drive some custom for the restaurant, but ultimately, like, I just have to get out there and talk about it. When I started this company, I was basically like off Instagram. I didn't really want to involve myself with social media. I really hate filming myself, and like it's like banging my head against the wall thinking about Instagram and social media and stuff like that. But it's such an important place for me to like actually get on there and talk about the wines. And frustratingly, the best engagement I ever get is when I do video myself talking, because I'd rather just put up a post and write something. But for me, all of those little bits, like the effort that is put into going and running a tasting, and the sort of self-loathing I have to get over when I video myself, I think it's worth it to be able to share the wines with people.
So, could you give us some specifics on either an event like that you've hosted and you thought went particularly well, or maybe even one that you're planning and is on the horizon?
Yeah, sure. I mean, some of the best events I've done have been really casual events. I did one with a local pub called La Station, a pub I adore. I've been drinking there since I could drink, and it's still my regular. Take my son there all the time when I pick him up from nursery. And they do this fantastic event called Seafood at the Station every summer. And I just took over they've got 2 bars and they only run one for that event because it gets really busy and it's easier for them to like direct all the custom through one bar. So I took over the other one and just set up a like wine bar in a separate part of the pub, basically, while we knew there would be footfall there, and had some pretty wacky wines on for a traditional country pub. A lot of skin contact wines, some pretty low intervention stuff. But it was a forum where I could meet customers who were clearly there because they were interested in the seafood element, and the seafood was sort of championed by a guy called Mike Warner, who runs a company called A Passion for Seafood, who is like the guy when it comes to talking about sustainability and seafood. So I knew that everybody who was going to be there was sort of interested again in that story of product. So yeah, I was there with my wines talking about them. That went really well. It drove some good custom for the pub as well, which is important to me. I don't just want to show up and try and sell my own stuff and not make it worthwhile for the customer. And I've got a really exciting project this year where I've sort of taken up residency once a month in a restaurant on the coast called The Suffolk, run by a great restaurateur called George Pell, who has like really helped me out, to be honest, in the sense that he's just liked what I'm doing and liked the story and just helped me in any way he can. So he's kind of given me his private room once a month to run a tasting, and he's let me kind of just do what I want in there. So I've got one next week and we're doing English wines, and I spent a couple of days last week driving around Kent meeting producers, and like really getting on top of the story. So I have met now when I go into that tasting next week, I can pour these wines and I can say I've met this producer. I walked around the vines, walked around the winery, like really got into the nitty gritty of it with them. And this is why I'm excited by it. And then talk to the customers in a really authentic way. You know, fundamentally, like those wines I just love. And I think that there's a story to English wine that's not really being shouted out about as much as it perhaps could be, in the sense that with our sort of short history of winemaking and our lack of AOCs or PDO rules, it means that winemakers could be super creative, and that we've got some amazingly innovative and forward-thinking winemakers in our country. I love the fact that next week I'll have a forum to go and talk to people about that. And inevitably, like for me, it's like, so I've got 2 sides. I've got like the importer side where like that's really important that I make sure that the restaurant is doing well, that they've got wines that I'm proud of, but that also actually do move through their list. And then I've got the other side, which is like my own website and retail, where if I go and do a tasting and I pour wines for, even if it's 10 people, if one of them becomes a customer, like for life, hopefully, like they get to know me, they like what I'm talking about, and then they trust me for their wine purchases. Even if they still go to Waitrose or Tesco and buy their sort of, everyday wines there, but come and see me once a month for something special, like that's great. And it's just, for me, it's like slow burn of acquiring customers who really want to learn more about wine, who I can talk to about in a really like relaxed and like informal but informative way. Like so many people, I'm like less interested in like, I want to sell you as much wine as possible. Yeah. It's just like, if you drink that, I'm really excited because I love this wine and I want you to try it.
Totally. I'm so happy that you brought that up, actually, Ben, because I see, I'll give you an example. Last year around this time, symposium, and in my life, I've never, in the space of 3 days, I've never heard more people talking about boomers, Gen X, Gen Z. There was this obsession with, you've got to do this for this market, do that for that market. And I feel as though, your point there is ultimately it's about trust, right? It's like people kind of want to be led, they want to have new experiences, but also, in terms of your business, your scale, again, it's about connection. And when people come into the fold, you want them, you need them, and by the sound of things, they treat them right, and they will hang around. The point I'm making is it's not transactional. People are not just demographics, right? People don't just behave in one way because they're 50 and in another way because they're 30. It's a lot more about you building the connection. You're one person. The restaurants are small and hands-on, and what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing is you're going deep rather than going broad here, and I think that's a really valuable connection. And I think that probably then plays out in terms of loyalty and in terms of trust, and ultimately, as a business, in terms of how much people spend with you across that lifetime value.
Yeah, I totally agree. Trust and experience it's kind of my 2 pillars of how to move forwards with this. I need people to trust that I'm doing my part by, when I'm going around France, I'm asking the right questions of producers and ensuring that I kind of know everything about them in order to be able to understand the wine in the best way. And then when I've got it back in England to talk about it and really share, what it's like to have made this wine in this place. And I love sharing the story, which is where the experience comes in. And when I do a tasting and I talk about a producer I've found, like the story of me finding the producer is in a way as important as the story of the producer, in the sense that, like, the wine is fundamentally always the most important thing, but when people are buying it, they want somebody they can talk to and find out why this wine has ended up in this country, basically. And because none of the wines that I've brought here have ended up for any other reason than I've been over to France, I've met this producer, I love their wines, and I decided to bring it home. I can't get around the fact that, the story and the experience and that trust, as you talk about, is kind of the most important part of me selling a bottle of wine.
I love it. Okay, and I feel like we're kind of coming full circle now in terms of I think we're getting closer to how a wine gets on your radar, the next step that you take in terms of going over there, and ultimately that bridge, as I mentioned earlier, between the producer and the consumer. One part that I think really is going to be interesting, and again, I don't think a lot of people talk about, and I don't think a lot of questions are kind of asked around, are red flags. I asked for your red flags when selecting a new wine, and you mentioned a disconnect between the grape grower and the winemaker as point one, and the second point was hard to find information about what they're doing in the vineyard and the winery. The first one of those seems really specific, which is great. That disconnect. So can we start there? Like how is that something that you can tell, and why is it so important, do you think?
Yeah, I wrote that down and immediately was like, do I agree with that? Because there's this thing I have, right? So, like, if somebody asks me what kind of wines do you stock, I don't necessarily just sell natural wines. I don't sell just organic wines. I don't sell just biodynamic wines. Really, what links them all together to me is the fact that I have a clear story from grape to glass, effectively, from that producer. Because I drive around France meeting producers and you speak to them, some have really compelling reasoning for why they don't farm organically. There is a discourse around how you farm that, it's so easy to sit here in a warm house in England and say that I'm not going to drink anything that isn't farmed organically. But then when you get there and you see somebody's vineyard and what they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, if they decide, the person who farms there all day, every day, that it might be better to spray once or twice conventional chemicals instead of having, because this is how it works in their particular plot of vines, instead of spraying, copper 10 times a year across the vines. And they personally believe that it's better for the soil health, it's better for the environment, it's better for their family health. Who am I to say no to that? But for me, that story, understanding a winemaker and that they're in the vineyard thinking about that every day, that's what I like to see. That's who I like talking to. I come from a farming background. My brother's a farmer. He spends his life outside in the field, and so do the winemakers. And for me to ever tell him how to farm would be ridiculous, because I'm not out there every day. I don't see, like, the nitty gritty issues every day. But what I do believe is that whichever bracket of farming that the people I work with fall into, they are, at the end of the day, farmers who every decision they wake up in the morning is trying to do the best thing for their own health, for the plant health, and for the quality of the product at the end of it. And so for me, I really love working with somebody who grows their grapes themselves, takes those grapes at harvest into a winery and then makes the wine for themselves, because it's that whole story. Coming from a farming background, we grow cereal crops, so wheat and barley, and nobody really has any idea where that wheat and barley goes. It gets sold to a company, and it might go into animal feed, might go into bread. And I, as much as I love farming and, all of that, I did always feel a bit of a disconnect between the crop we grew and the product we made at the end of it. Whereas a winemaker, when you go meet them and, their vines are right outside their window and that's all they ever think about. And then on top of that, they're also taking on the incredibly hard task of then making wine out of it. Like, that for me, that's kind of it. That's what I was saying. A red flag is when somebody is just like, well, I just bought these grapes and made this wine from it, kind of thing, which doesn't happen very often. That said, when I wrote that, I did immediately think, but there is an argument that says that it's better to have that disconnect, in the sense that just because you can grow great grapes doesn't mean you can make great wine. And there is an argument that says that actually having them as two separate processes, in the sense that somebody who spends their entire life only focused on making incredible grapes, and then that goes to somebody whose 100% focus is making incredible wine from incredible grapes, there's an argument that says that that is as good, if not better, way of doing it. I just love the sort of romantic side of the farming to the end thing.
Yeah.
Which is why, for me, in my very specific small company, where I'm the only buyer and the only one selling, a red flag for me is just any whiff of a disconnect just puts me off really quickly.
I'm getting more insight from that question than you may think that you're giving there. It's like, I think that's mega insightful. Why? Because we're getting really down to the sort of granular level of understanding you and how you want to run your business and what your ethics are, but then also about what your customers want. Because it's that is that in a nutshell, and almost in a way, what I think you've really described there, Ben, is that grape to glass, that phrase again, isn't it? And almost what you're saying is that you almost covered red flags and green flags in two there, because it's like saying, okay, if there's any interruption of that journey, you telling it to me, you telling it to Ben, then when I go back to England, I can't then ethically, for me, I can't ethically stand in front of a group of people and represent that, because there's a few pages missing from that story. And I think it's also so interesting because what you've also then spoken to, and I completely agree, it's like saying, okay, if we want to, have the Avengers of winemaking, make this super duper best wine in the world, we probably would do what you're saying there, right? We would have the the best cooper in the world, we have the best grape grower in the world, we'd have the best winemaker, and we'd have this maybe a consultant sitting on top of them, and we'd have this world-class designer, and kind of all of these things. And it sounds like, and I don't think I'm going out too far on a limb here, it's like that's not necessarily what floats your boat. It's like, it's more, I can actually trace from grape to glass, and I can connect with that story, and I can represent it in the way that my customer wants.
Yeah, I think you're right. Ideally, like the grower I'm talking about would also be the best cooper on the planet and everything else. But yeah, that's not feasible. And actually, to be honest, if you went through my website and looked at all the wines, not every single wine is like perfectly transparent like that. Because in reality, like, to do that, to be that winemaker that's got 3 or 4 hectares of vines and does everything yourself, it means that the wine is not going to be an everyday wine at the end of it, fundamentally. Particularly by the time it's gone through duty and everything else and got here. So I do have wines that are everyday wines. Chin Chin's a good example of that. That in reality comes from a presumably very big operation. There's only one way of getting that much wine out. But it's nice, tastes great, really good value. But I guess the point, and that goes back to the truth, is if anybody asks me, and it probably says something like that on the website anyway, that's what I'll be like. But that's why that can sit on the wine list of 12 quid or whatever it is on my website.
Yeah.
And other wines cost more because there's this traceability element here. And it's no different to buying a pack of sausages from a supermarket or going and buying some rare breed sausages from a great butcher. It's just like that. And I buy supermarket sausages all the time, but if I am in a butcher and want some really good sausages, I'm quite happy to buy some really good sausages. And I think the hard thing I find is that wine has this truth element to it and this story, and it can be this amazing product that ticks every box you want from a produce-led product, i.e. ticks every box of, I know who the farmer is, I know how he farmed, he's amazing, this is his background, and this is what it's all about, and this is his favourite song or her favourite song, and all of that. But at the same time, like, if I'm just on a beach somewhere and I just want to drink a £10 bottle of Vigna Sol, or however much Vigna Sol costs now, that still is enjoyable. And you don't have to have it you don't have to worry about grower and all of that all the time. But if you do, I'm a pretty good person to speak to about it. It's kind of where I'm at.
I love it. Okay, final question for you. And this is one that I was going to ask every guest, and it's some feedback really for me. I have been speaking to lots of buyers in the build up to this kind of, off mic, let's say. And rightly or wrongly, I've created a model, like a synthesis of what I hear them telling me are the 3 most important areas that they look at when they're assessing a wine. So almost red flags and green flags right down into this essence of these 3 elements. So the first element that they tell me about is the quality. So it's like, Okay, is it good wine? Is it bad wine? Of course, it's mega subjective, but that's point one. It's quality. Second, value for money. They're obviously, and as you mentioned there, it's a business. You've got to know your customer. You've got to know what they're willing to pay and happily pay and pay again. And then the third element is the distinctiveness. So how different it is maybe to what you already got there, but also how different it's going to appear and it's going to impact your customer. Is it going to grab their attention? Are they going to remember it? Are they going to come back and ask for it again? Or is it just going to be so quality, value for money, distinctiveness? I'd love to get your feedback on that and build on that and see what you think.
I think great points, well made. How that relates to like my specifically small business in the middle of nowhere is they're important, right? Like every time I look at a wine, like I assess it in the way I was taught at WSET. I still use that Rubicon. And the reason I use that is because that is a fantastic way of assessing quality above all else. And so quality is incredibly important to me. Distinctiveness, I think, is really important. I love wines of character, and that character, I don't know whether distinctiveness just comes down to pure taste or whether distinctiveness also comes down to the story behind it, because I like working with winemakers who have a very distinctive story as well as their wines being distinctive. Understanding what makes them tick and why their wines really do stand out is as much a part of the winemaker as it is about the actual wine. Prices, what was the second one?
Value for money specifically, though. It might be mega expensive, but it can also be good value for money at 100 quid, can't it? Or 10 quid.
Yeah, absolutely. And value is incredibly important. I mean, like fundamentally, like when I buy a pallet of wine, like I know I'm going to sit on it for a while. The cash flow is going to take a while. I have to make sure that wine is actually worth it being in here and me taking the punt on it, and that customers are getting what they should. I guess, my value is like probably around that £25 mark. Like, is this seriously delivering at 25 quid? And if the answer is yes to all those three, then I'm happy with it. I suppose for me though, like I really am the guy that drives to France, finds a winemaker and brings it back. Like I really want, in a small way, because I only import direct from 2 producers, but I hope to have less. Like, I like working with other importers as well, but I'd like to decrease the amount of wines I buy that are already in the country and increase the amount of wines that I work with direct. For me, like those three things are a big part of the overall picture, but the overall picture is like the sort of romantic way that you kind of think that your grandparents probably bought wine off somebody who had actually been there, brought the wine in the back of a van home and was selling it, kind of thing. And that story for me, the distinctiveness of the story, I guess, is the overriding not factor, because it's a facet. Those other three are important, but
I love it.
I don't know. Fundamentally, it's like funny. Like I'm not like a huge businessman at heart. I am a romantic person. My background was music, and wine for me is so product led that in anybody's right mind, the first 2 producers I brought over were Domaine Serre-Basson, who has 4 hectares of vines in Fan Sobre, which is not a like hugely popular region, right? And then, or a hugely well-known region. I think when people try it, it's very popular. And then the other producer I work with is Domaine Roasting Teilhard. They're from the Coteaux Lyonnais. I mean, I didn't even know the Coteaux Lyonnais existed until I was pootling around in that part of the world and stumbled across it. And it's this unbelievable region that really stands out for me. Almost its distinctiveness is the fact that I hadn't heard of it. And then you go and try the wines and they're amazing quality and value because it's a lesser known region. But for me, like that was just like, man, I can go and take back this pallet of wine from somewhere in France that nobody's ever heard of. I drove to France. I thought these wines were amazing, and now I'm here, and you should come and try them because they are incredible. And it kind of, for me, is as simple as that. I'm like the world's biggest overthinker, i.e. like lie in bed all night, every night, thinking about something tiny like I forgot to do that day. And yet, when I make big decisions, it's obviously like, what's the worst that can happen? Let's do it. And what that inevitably means is that I'm taking punts on wines because they're incredible, not because I needed a wine that would fit into the range that offered better value than my best-selling wine, like which is a Macon Village. Like I wasn't out. That would have been the sensible thing to do. Let's go and find something that I can, that offers the same quality for a better price or something like that. Instead, I was just like, let's drive around until I find somebody amazing. And when I find somebody amazing, I'll see if I can make it work.
Really enjoyed that conversation today, Ben. And in closing, I want to kind of put you on the spot a little bit and just ask you to tell me and to tell the listeners, first, where can we find you? Website, social media, which you obviously love. But then also give us an insight into what events you've got coming up, and what you, even if you haven't got things signed and sealed, what are the aspirations around events? What would you like to be doing in the summer, in the autumn, in the winter, as we move through 2026?
So basically, the easiest way to find anything about me is my company is called Parade Wines, which is a reference to a song by The National. If anybody understands that reference and wants to shout out to me, I will send them a free bottle of wine, because nobody yet has worked it out. But yeah, so Parade Wines, it's Parade Wines on Instagram, www.paradewines.com. I think I'm on Facebook. I'm not really sure. I'm pretty sure everything I post on Instagram goes onto Facebook. And if you want to come find me at events, follow Instagram. That's where I talk about it most. The ones I'm really excited about is that monthly residency I've got with the Suffolk. Such a beautiful venue. The food is incredible. George is like the best host ever, and his staff are great. Lewis behind the bars, really cool. Drew is like the best front of house man I've ever met. And yeah, somehow I fit in there with some wines. Another thing I'm really excited about is, so my family background, farming. We, with the changing tides of agriculture, have found some quite beautiful old barns that I am, in my spare time, working on converting into having my own sort of event space, which will be, as the rest of my company is, in the middle of nowhere. It's quite hard to get to, but it will be lots of fun when we get there. I did one event last year called Lagwinget, which was based on a sort of outdoor bar I had had one too many mojitos at when I was on holiday last year in the Rhone. And I just thought it was mega fun. So we tried it on the farm. I set up a wine bar. Wines that speak of people and place that you don't find very easily at a very reasonable price, considering it was a trade event, not a trade event, but a event. I was just trying to get the wines out there. That was really good fun. I will be doing lots more of that this year. So if you are in Suffolk, it's a fun place to stay.
A huge thanks to today's guest, Ben Easey of Parade Wines. Make sure you visit paradewines.com. The link is below to learn more. Find his main social media handles and, of course, buy some of these amazing wines that he's bringing in. Once again, there is so much for me to take away and reflect on from this episode. And I think for me, number one has to be the work that Ben describes there about building a network and essentially building a market for these types of wines. I love the examples that he gave about making connections with butchers and people who are naturally passionate about local produce there in Suffolk. And I think that Ben fitting in there as the wine guy is a great role that he's obviously well equipped to play. I think his point as well about restaurants kind of sourcing amazing food and fish and all these other ingredients, and then the wine kind of letting things down. I think it's something that we do see out there. And I like Ben's attitude towards bringing that conversation up. As he says, not going in there to kind of rewrite and kind of take over the wine list, but just to be a presence and to be really a partner and a guide in what that different type of wine, that more quality, the more producer-driven type of wine can kind of look like and ultimately taste like. The second part of the conversation that really stood out for me was a conversation around customer and pricing. I've seen that myself in retail, where people will have that larger budget and in essence will kind of pad out the basket with those midweek wines and then save up some of that budget for maybe a splurge on a birthday or a Sunday roast. Two things really come out from that conversation then. One is that average price can then hide a lot of detail and nuance. As Ben said there, his kind of average price of £17, that's completely hiding all of that nuance and detail that he was able to go into. But I think also for producers and regions, I think it's really important to think about how lower priced wines being available can actually then drive the higher price spend further down the line. And again, if you've got somebody who is passionate, I don't see there's any reason why one region or even one producer can't put forward wines both at the everyday level, but also then at that higher level. But of course, it needs to be well explained. Which brings me to the third point that really stood out from the conversation, which was all around storytelling. And I thought this was, again, another point really well made. fascinating, that whole thing around, the Avengers of winemaking, everyone doing their bit, the best cooper, the best grape grower, the best winemaker, and a kind of a consultant on top of them, perhaps would make the best wine, but wouldn't, in Ben's case, lead to him being able to, represent the winemaker in front of his audience, and then also kind of tell the best story. Would he be able to interact with all of those people if they were all, different roles and kind of at different locations? And once again, what is Ben talking about when he's at the front of the room? It's the wine story, it's the experience, it's the trust. Of course, the knowledge is there. The door is always open for people to ask about the wine and how it's made and all the rest of it. But that is the thing that Ben is passionate about. And I think driving that passion draws people closer and gets them hooked, really. Gets them, to fall in love with wine as much as he has and I have, and as I'm sure you have. And the unwritten rule then is that Ben can ethically tell those stories because he's been there, because he's driven around, and because it's, as he said, largely a passion-driven discovery in the first place, rather than a spreadsheet-driven discovery. That passion is still there, that ethical approach is still there, and people notice that, and people are responding to that, which is absolutely brilliant. As a reminder, Market Pulse UK is a 6-part podcast series released on Interpreting Wine Podcast, and also a free in-depth report. Register to receive this when it's released at interpretingwine.com/MPUK report. And next time on Interpreting Wine, in episode 601, I'll be speaking with David Lapsey of Austere Consultancy. So do subscribe to be alerted when the episode goes live, and I will see you then.